People often say, where are the intermediate fossils? Show us your intermediate fossils. There are plenty of intermediate fossils, and one of the best examples is whales. The modern whales are up there. Here's a series of fossils back in time. Dorodon about 36 million years ago, Rhodocetus about 47.5 million years, Pachycetus about 48.5 million years. And you can see they form a lovely series of intermediates. As you go from old to young, Pachycetus, Rhodocetus, gradually losing the hind legs to Dorodon, which has almost lost the hind legs completely. Modern whales have completely lost the hind legs. There are some vestigial bones, some remnant bones buried deep inside the body. A lovely series of intermediates getting progressively more and more specialized in living in the sea.
If evolution indeed accounts for the history of life on Earth, we would expect to see a gradual evolutionary history unfolding in the fossil record with an innumerable number of transitional forms documenting the transformation of one major group into another major group. And we would see this over and over and over again. Yet what we see when we look at the fossil record is an absence of transitional forms. In fact, Darwin recognized this when he wrote his book on the origin of species. He had a number of chapters devoted to problems with this theory, and one of the problems Darwin noted is this. By this theory, according to Darwin, his theory of evolution, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the Earth? And in fact, this problem that Darwin recognized then persists today. Stephen Jay Gould, the late evolutionary biologist and scientist from Harvard University, said this: all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. And so the fact here is this: the fossil record does not support the evolutionary paradigm. It doesn't look like we'd expect it to look if indeed biological evolution is true. Yet evolutionary biologists are not deterred by these problems. They argue that this simply reflects the incompleteness of the fossil record. And they like to point to examples of transitional forms that they argue do indeed document macroevolutionary changes. Two of the examples of transitional forms that I want to talk about that are prominently discussed by evolutionary biologists that are in some biology textbooks are the so-called fishopods and the origin of whales. Supposedly whales evolved through a series of transitional forms, beginning with some kind of wolf-like creature, Pachycetus, that then evolves through a series of transitional forms to give rise to the first true whales. All this happening in the neighborhood of about 55 million years ago. But just like with the origin of tetrapods, we see that this transition takes place very rapidly in a range of 10 million years or less, and that we have transitional forms that co-occur in the fossil record. They don't appear in a sequential manner. And this, again, is troubling from an evolutionary perspective. It's a pattern that you would not expect to see if indeed these were transitional forms. So then how do we explain these forms that seem to be well adapted to live at the water's edge, whether they're fishopods or supposedly transitional forms leading up to the origin of whales? Well, again, I would argue that these are well-designed organisms, perfectly suited to live at the water's edge. And I would view them as being creatures that were created by God, that existed in this environment and then later disappeared. And that whales were created through God's direct intervention, as well were the first vertebrates on the land, the first tetrapods. And so again, these transitional forms are actually well-designed creatures that live at the water's edge, where scientists are imposing a pattern on this data because they look at this from an evolutionary vantage point, with that perspective, with that bias in play. So how do we make sense of these so-called transitional intermediate forms that are found in the fossil record from a creation model perspective? Well, to appreciate that, we need to introduce a concept known as mosaic designs. These are designs that essentially represent a blending of the properties or characteristics or features of two designs. So when we look at these organisms that existed at the water's edge, they're mosaic organisms that display properties and characteristics that represent a blending of aquatic organisms and terrestrial organisms, bringing together the best features of both designs to produce organisms that are ideally suited, again, to live at the water's edge. We could see these as examples of the work of a creator, not the outworking of evolutionary processes. Let me illustrate this with an example of a mosaic design that probably almost everybody's familiar with, particularly if you like to eat at certain fast food restaurants. And that example would be a spork. This, of course, is an implement that has the properties of both a spoon and a fork. Whoever produced this object felt like this would be an ideal implement to help people eat certain types of foods, bringing together, again, the best properties of a spoon and a fork. When you look at the spork, you think this is the work of a designer. You don't think that this is a transitional intermediate documenting the transformation of a spoon into a fork. Instead, you recognize this as the work of a designer. And this brings us to the final point that I want to make today, and that is this, that many of the features that we see in the fossil record that are interpreted from an evolutionary perspective find ready interpretation within a creation model viewpoint.